What is happening, everybody? My name is Anton Dieball. You probably know me as a skeptical human on YouTube, and in today's video, we are going to be talking about creationism. Specifically, we're going to address the argument that if you actually look at the fossil record, what you find is that there's clear evidence for the biblical flood, and the fossil record does not, in fact, support evolution. One argument you'll hear creationists make is the action fossils argument. Basically, the way this goes is Andrew Snelling, he gives a lot of lectures for Answers in Genesis. He does a lot of writing on their website. He made the argument that when you find fossils where it's like a fish preserved in the middle of eating another fish, for example, or maybe you'll find a fossil where it's an ichthyosaur that's in the process of giving birth, and then it was fossilized, like midway through giving birth. He'll look at fossils like this, and he'll say, oh, clearly because they were preserved in the middle of performing some sort of action. That means that the preservation must have happened instantaneously. There must have been some sort of huge catastrophe that did this, and clearly this is proof of the flood described in the Bible. Now, there's a lot of problems with this argument here. Notice first, there's the enormous mental leap that's being made. He argues that because we find this one example, or, there's a handful of examples like this in the fossil record, he jumps from that to, because there was this one localized catastrophe that we found here, that therefore means that a global catastrophe took place on the scale of the biblical flood that we read about in the Bible. And it just doesn't at all make sense to make that kind of leap. I make an analogy in the piece that I publish on my website, askepticalhuman.com, on the subject. I make an analogy between this argument and a detective, where it's like, well, a detective's on site, there's a murder that he's investigating, and he's like, well, it appears that the woman was murdered, which therefore means that all women were murdered. It makes absolutely no sense to jump from this one event to, therefore, this happens all across the world, in all circumstances. It just doesn't make any sense. And even the more basic assumption being made here, that catastrophes are the preservation mechanism, I think doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Or, at the very least, it's not necessarily the case in the examples he cites here. Don't get me wrong, there are examples in the fossil record where, like fossil caches, for example, sometimes you'll find a bunch of different fossils. It's like basically an ecosystem from that time period, fully preserved. These things can be found in the fossil record, where maybe there was like some sort of underwater landslide or whatever that preserved it. So sometimes catastrophes are the preservation mechanism, but it's not even necessarily the case in these examples here. Like the fish eating another fish, there are just alternative explanations that he's not considering here. Like, what if in the process of trying to swallow the fish, there were spikes, protective spikes on this fish that impaled the fish and made it so that he, bled out and died as a result of trying to swallow his meal? What if the fish got lodged inside of his throat and, he was just incapable of feeding himself and he ended up dying that way? And then he sunk to the bottom and then he was preserved more gradualistically. Or in the case of the ichthyosaur, preserved giving birth, maybe it died as a result of giving birth from some sort of complications that led to internal hemorrhaging or something. And again, then it was preserved more gradualistically. The creationists they're not considering the alternative explanations for fossils like this. And what they do is they grab a scrap of evidence and they immediately try to contort it and morph it so that it matches up with the conclusion that they've already decided in advance that they agree with. And I think this is a good example of that. Final point about action fossils is, how would this even work according to the flood model? Like, even if you're a believer in the biblical flood, as described in the Bible, what would happen here to where there's a fish swimming around, and then just like a several meter thick layer of mud just like fucking plops down from the sky and just like preserves shit? Like how would this, even if there is a flood going on, I don't even understand what possible mechanism could just instantaneously preserve the organisms. Sort of like, the humans preserved in the Pompeii eruption, where they're like in the middle of doing what they were doing at that instance. How would a large flood cause this? It's not like the silt would just instantly materialize into a super thick layer. Or like, were there these underwater mountains that were just equally spaced out all across the world during the Great Flood? and they just synchronize themselves to where they're like 1, 2, 3, underwater landslide across the whole world. Like, it doesn't even make sense according to the flood model how this would work. So when you try to follow this argument to the logical conclusion that creationists reach, it's not a logical conclusion. It just doesn't make any fucking sense how this would even work. Another argument they'll make is the incompatible fossils argument. Snelling, in that same lecture, he gives the example of a toothed whale and a marsupial possum that were preserved together in the same location. And what he concludes from this is he's like, well, you know, these organisms, one lives in the ocean, the other lives on land. It doesn't make sense that they'd be found in the same environment together, preserved like this. Unless there was a global flood, like the one that we read about in the Bible, that mixed them all up and jumbled them together, and then they were preserved together. Once again, he's making a huge unjustified mental leap here, where he's like, well, you know, we found these two organisms mixed up together, therefore all organisms were mixed up together. It just doesn't make any sense to jump to that conclusion like that. All we can conclude from this example of two organisms being found together is that literally only these two organisms were preserved together. Why would you jump from that to therefore all organisms got mixed up and jumbled together? Again, it makes no sense. And again, it's very clear that he's just working backwards from his conclusion. Two fossils like this, a toothed whale, a marsupial possum being found together, there are all kinds of much more reasonable and much simpler explanations for how this could happen. Maybe the possum, for example, was, you know, maybe he was trying to cross the river on some sort of log or something, and he, like, slipped and fell into the river. He drowned, he was carried downstream, and then preserved, you know, in the sediment that's deposited at the river delta, where it meets the ocean. That's one example. Maybe the possum didn't even fall in the river and die that way. Maybe the possum just died on land, you know, just, like, through the normal course of its life. It just died of old age or whatever the fuck possums die of. And maybe there was some sort of flood, a flash flood. Maybe the river was flooded that, you know, spilled over onto the land and then ultimately pushed the possum into the water and carried it downstream to be preserved this way. The point is, you can come up with all kinds of much more reasonable, much more simple explanations for this. And just to look at such a basic finding like this and be like, obviously Noah's Ark was real, you know? Obviously there was a global flood because we found two animals preserved together. It just doesn't make any logical sense to jump to that conclusion. Now, before we move on to our next argument, a quick word from our sponsor, me. I am our sponsor. Specifically my merch store, skepticalstuff.com. Recently opened, recently launched, recently populated with some fantastic, hilarious shirt designs. Specifically, the religion-based ones that we're gonna take a quick look at here are the God Works in Mysterious Ways t-shirt, my personal favorite on the merch store probably. We also have the God is Always Watching You t-shirt, another classic. And finally, we have the Jesus is My Co-Pilot t-shirts. Get these today at skepticalstuff.com. It's a great way to support the work that I do, support my channel, make it so I actually make some fucking money from this. I've been doing YouTube for several years now, and I'm still operating at a loss, as sad as that is. When you factor in, you know, website hosting, video editing softwares, stock photo and video assets, all the different things that I use to produce my content, when you total together the expenses versus what I'm making, I'm still in the red, as sad as that is. But by going to skepticalstuff.com and buying one or several of my merch items, you can help to correct that imbalance and make me a little moolah. So, with that said, we're going to move on to the next argument here, which is, again, made by Andrew Snelling, and that's the argument that when you find fossilized sea creatures up on land or even high up on mountaintops, this is obviously confirmation of the biblical account that the waters rose so high that they overtopped the highest mountains on the planet. This is one of those arguments where it's like, at least it's conceivable to where you can, like, think through it and you're like, at least it's compatible with the conclusion that creationists reach. Because in the case of the action fossils argument, it just doesn't even fucking make sense how a global flood would instantly preserve animals like this. So, to their credit, at least this argument isn't just on its face laughable and easily dismissed. So they have that going for them here in this case. This is one of those arguments where the most basic understanding of geology and rudimentary science can provide you with simple explanations for fossilized sea creatures up on land. Really, two main things could explain this. Number one would simply be changing sea levels over time. Like on the North American continent, for example, there used to be a large seaway that cut across it called the Western Interior Seaway. And Michael J. Everhart, that's his name. He wrote this classic book called Oceans of Kansas, where he talks all about this. He talks about all the different types of organisms that live there. You had the ichthyosaurs and different aquatic reptiles and large sharks and stuff like that. All kinds of fascinating organisms that actually lived in the seaway that used to be here. And it was reasonably deep enough that it could sustain a pretty substantial marine life population. And this is because sea levels at the time were much higher. You had the planet was warmer. A lot of the ice caps on our planet, they melted, and they allowed for this. And so if you have circumstances where, like, well, there used to be a fucking ocean or a seaway or a lake here, and it's no longer here, that's a very simple explanation for how it could be the case that you find fossilized sea creatures up on land. The other one is just basic plate tectonics. You could have a convergent plate boundary where it's like oceanic crust here, land mass is here, and they just sort of smash together because of tectonic forces. And what happens is the oceanic crust gets smashed in between, and it just gets pushed up into the mountaintop. So that right there is a very simple mechanism for how it could be the case that you find this marine life, not just on land, but high up on mountaintops. And this is really just geology 101 right here. And I find that interesting because Andrew Snelling, this guy has a PhD in geology, and he doesn't seem to understand the basics of the field that he's supposed to be an expert in. I'll leave it to you guys to sort that one out. One major problem with the creationist argument, where they're like, well, the fossil record clearly supports the Noah's Ark account as described in the Bible. There's a very massive problem that they have to contend with here, and that's the fact that the fossil record has a clear order and progression to it that very convincingly makes it appear that evolution is the case. You'll have, in the case of turtle evolution, for example, you'll have one of the early ancestors of turtles where, it has thickened ribs, but they're not fully developed. And then you graduate to sort of an intermediate form where it has a partial shell developed, but not yet the full thing as we typically imagine it in the case of turtles. And then from there, it goes all the way to turtles that have the fully developed shell as we tend to imagine it in the turtle form, so to speak. And that's just one example, but it's that multiplied by 10 million. When you look at all the different evolutionary sequences that we see in the fossil record, where there's a clear order, there's a clear progression, there's a clear sequence of biological changes taking place over time. So if evolution didn't take place, why would it very convincingly look like evolution took place? Is Satan testing us with these fossils? Is this just an extraordinary coincidence? What's the explanation here? I think the simplest and most reasonable explanation is that evolution appears to have taken place in the fossil record because it actually did take place. Creationists, they do their best to try to explain away this order in the fossil record, and when you look at the explanations they put forth, it's hard not to just laugh out loud because it's pretty hilarious, some of the explanations they come up with. One is Henry Morris. He's a writer for the Institute for Creation Research, as they call themselves. I'm not sure what kind of research they're doing over there on creationism, but I'm sure it's very interesting stuff. He published an article on the subject where he tried to argue that this order and progression in the fossil record is actually caused by ecological stratification among the different organisms, where you have, simple invertebrate organisms live at the lowest elevations, and then you have, the reptiles at slightly higher elevations, and then you have mammals higher still, and then all the way at the tippy top you have humans that live at the top. And he presents this narrative where it's like, well, what appears to be different organisms evolving over time is actually just those different species and groups of organisms conveniently living at different altitudes, which they were then preserved in during the global flood. This is just completely fucking laughable, because you can just look out at the biological world and just disconfirm it. There are all kinds of counterexamples where you have like spiders living at very high elevations, for example, or you have mammals living at very low elevations. It's not like humans live exclusively on fucking mountaintops, so why do we only appear in the very highest of rock layers? It just doesn't make any sense, and there are plenty of counterexamples to this. Morris, in that same article, he presents another one, and this one has to be my favorite. Of all the creationist explanations, of all the arguments they make in general, this is probably one of my absolute favorites because it's just so fucking hilarious. Morris argues that the distribution in the fossil record is also explained by the fact that different organisms are quicker and craftier, and they were thus more capable of outrunning the floodwaters, and they were preserved at later times as a result of this. So, you know, the humans were the most mobile, were the craftiest, were the most cunning, so we were most capable of outrunning the floodwaters, and that's why we appear at the highest elevations at the most recent time periods in the fossil record. Again, this is, I mean, what do you even say to that? Like, credit to them for having an active imagination, I guess. This is another one of those examples where it's like there are plenty of counterexamples to this that you can just fucking look out at the world and you find. Like, a good way to test this, if you're a believer in this hypothesis, is just go out to the nearest field, go out to the nearest area where there's a little bit of wildlife, and try to catch a reptile with your bare hands. You know, find a lizard and try to catch him with your bare hands. Try to go find a mouse or a fucking rabbit and try to catch it with your bare hands. How about a bird, for that matter? Like, birds can fucking fly, yet they appear tens of millions of years earlier in the geological rock layers. Meaning, according to the creationist narrative, birds are somehow much less mobile and capable of eluding the floodwaters than humans. How is that the case if birds can just fucking fly? The floodwaters get close to them, they're like, oh shit, and they flap their wings and they bail. It doesn't make any sense. And think about some of the other exceptions there would be. Like, even if we granted this as a general rule, where it's like, yeah, as a general rule, you know, that there's the sort of stratification by craftiness that does exist, there would still be exceptions to this rule. Just by chance alone, maybe you would have some slow-moving dinosaurs whose starting point was higher. You know, they were out grazing, looking for food, and maybe they happened to be at a higher elevation when the flood started. Or vice versa, where a fast-moving organism happened to have a low starting point. Or in the course of outrunning the floodwaters, they unfortunately ran in the wrong direction and moved to a lower elevation. So you would find in the fossil record counterexamples to this narrative. There wouldn't be a perfect orderly sequence where there's literally never any examples of humans being found in, you know, the rocks of the Devonian, for example. What about in the case of humans? Again, because we're found so high up in the rock layers. What about morbidly obese humans? You know, some fat shit who can't run, can barely move. What about someone who's super old and, again, can barely move? Somebody who's injured or very sick and bedridden. You would find counterexamples in the fossil record. So where are these exceptions? It's not like the sequence that we find in the fossil record is like, yeah, you know, 80% of the time there's like, you know, trilobites occur before humans. No, it's 100% of the time. There are no counterexamples. So this is pretty clear evidence that the creationist is just flat wrong about this. Our old friend Andrew Snelling, this time in an article for Answers in Genesis. This guy gets busy, man. He's giving all kinds of lectures and publishing all kind of nonsense articles. He stays busy, that's for sure. Andrew Snelling, he presents another explanation, and that's the hydrodynamic sorting explanation, where it's like, well, the reason we see, you know, trilobites so early is because they're dense and they sink to the bottom. And the reason we see, you know, these organisms here and that organism there is because different densities and buoyancies cause them to sort of stratify into layers. And that's why there's an order to the fossil record. Again, I keep coming back to the same point. Even if this was a general rule, you'd find exceptions to this. Where, you know, like, one species of animal in this group would be denser, so they'd be higher or whatever, but you just don't see that. Wilfred Elders, he published a good piece where he made a really good point about this, where he's like, maybe the organisms as a whole, but what about the different parts of the organisms? Like dinosaur skin, for example, has the same density and buoyancy as a dinosaur femur, or a dinosaur spinal column or something like that. You know, why would all of the different parts, like the tooth of a certain whale species, why would that have the same density as all the different body parts of that same organism? That doesn't seem to make much sense, because a lot of time when organisms are fossilized, they get broken up into bits and different chunks are fossilized, and you don't necessarily have the whole thing intact, fully articulated. And that's something that doesn't make much sense. And you also have the different species that lived alongside those organisms that are also preserved at the same time. Like, you have not just the plants of a certain time period, but you also have the spores of that plant, both preserved in the same time period. Why would the spores and that plant have the exact same density? You know, you can just map this out to all the different parts of an organism, and you see it doesn't really make much sense. Something else I want to point out, this I think is a kind of interesting contradiction here. Notice that creationists, they try to have it both ways. Andrew Snelling, for example, he argues on the one hand, he's like, look at these incompatible fossils. We find this whale and this possum preserved together. My goodness, clearly that's proof that there was this chaotic global flood event that just mixed all these organisms into this disorganized, jumbled, unrecognizable mess. And then on the other hand, he's like, well, this same disorganized flood that I was just characterizing as chaotic and just mixing a bunch of shit together, that same flood also happened to perfectly sort these organisms by craftiness, by their ecological stratification, and by their hydrodynamic properties that these organisms have. So it's like, which one is it? Did it mix them all together into a big fucking jumbled mess, or did it perfectly sort them as well? They're trying to have it both ways, and it really seems to me like they're just firing shots in a bunch of different directions and hoping that one of them will connect. Another thing to consider is that certain rock layers that we see in the fossil record, during the time period that creationists tell us the flood was taking place, certain rock layers were formed by the activity of organisms. And think about the difficulty that poses for the creationist. Limestone, for example. There's a section in the Grand Canyon where it's like a 150-meter thick layer of limestone deposits. And this is during a period of time where the creationist says, these rock layers from this point to this point, for example, these were formed during the Great Flood, by the Great Flood itself. And so in the middle of this Great Flood period, we have limestone deposits being formed by organisms that are photosynthesizing at such a rapid and vigorous rate that they formed a 150-meter thick layer of limestone. How would this happen during the Great Flood, where presumably the waters would be all mixed together and muddy and silty, and it's a big fucking mess? Everything's dying. While this is happening, there's simultaneously so much photosynthesis going on that a 150-meter thick layer of limestone gets laid down. Please explain to me how that would work. I don't think it makes any sense. Other creationists, they engage in a bit of special pleading, where they try to argue, well, no, those rock layers, the limestone deposits, those were actually put down after the Great Flood. And they posit this really convoluted system where you have differing atmospheric levels of CO2, where it's like before, during, after the flood, CO2 levels wildly fluctuated in such a way that once the flood ended, they really ramped up the photosynthesis, and that's how they were able to put down that limestone layer so quickly. That to me seems like very obvious special pleading, where the evidence, it presents them with a serious difficulty and problem and contradiction. So they come up with all these cockamamie explanations for what sort of events could have been taking place. And you see this a lot with creationists as well, where they talk about, like, at the time, you know, the atmosphere had different properties. There's even regarding, like, radiometric dating, they do the same thing, where they posit, like, well, you know, maybe the rates of radiometric decay wildly fluctuated in the past versus today, and they jump through all sorts of hoops to try to make it so that, well, maybe conceivably this evidence is compatible with the beliefs I've already decided I agree with. And that to me is pretty clear proof that what they're doing is working back from their conclusion. They decide in advance, I accept the Bible, I believe that it's true, the Bible says this happened, therefore I accept it as dogma. And then from that conclusion, they find little scraps of evidence that they can interpret in such a way that is compatible with that viewpoint. They work back from their conclusion. And it's the exact opposite of how it should work in science, where you make the observations, you collect all the evidence, and then you go from there to the most reasonable conclusion. The creationists, they work backwards from this, and the arguments they make regarding the fossil record just don't stand up to scrutiny. Hopefully you found this video interesting and valuable. I'm definitely starting to do a new video format where instead of like full-on reading the script and, you know, spending like fucking 30, 40 hours editing it together painstakingly, I'm basically just going to repurpose the piece of writing that I publish on my website into a more casual lecture format where I'll, you know, edit in the appropriate graphics and, you know, stock video assets and shit like that. Hopefully you like this format more. It's a lot easier to produce, a lot less stressful. So expect more of this going forward. Make sure to subscribe for more videos, and later.